morning. It's good to be here. And when I think about the opportunity to speak again, it's been quite a while since I've been in the pulpit or presented a message. And it's funny, I got butterflies again. Nervous that I'm going to do well. And I know I'm not that kind of judgmental, but I worry about it. But I was thinking about the congregation as a whole. There's definitely individuals have encouraged me greatly from this particular congregation, and the congregation itself has supported me both physically, spiritually, monetarily, in ways that just words cannot express the amount of appreciation that I have. And so when I began to think about the lesson that I might present, I actually had a couple. I almost scared my dad in changing it in the last minute. But I wanted to encourage the congregation as a whole. Sometimes members of a congregation need to be encouraged about the work that the congregation is doing in order to be edified by it. Sometimes we don't have that, one-on-one personal connection, that others might have to individuals that are being helped or that Bible studies are being had with. But knowing that the congregation is working together to do the things that God would have us to do as a part of the body of Christ is something that we need to be encouraged by occasionally. And so I want to encourage this congregation in a way that is beneficial to each and every one of you individually. And so I thought about the churches of Asia, and I'm sure we've heard sermons about them, and this probably won't be a lot of new information, but it's good information about an example that we see in the Bible, and one that hopefully we can relate to, that you can relate to as a congregation in the work that is done here. In Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, we have an example of the church at Smyrna. Now, Smyrna, the root word, comes from the word myrrh. And if you remember, one of the gifts given to Christ was myrrh, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, this was a trading city, and one of the things that they traded there was myrrh. Now, myrrh itself means bitter. Well, that's not the meaning we want to take from this. We don't want to talk about the bitter church here in the Bible. We're talking about the part of myrrh that, when put to other elements, put with other elements, it smells wonderful. It's perfume. And, like with lots of perfumes, if you've ever gotten it on your tongue, it tastes horrible. But it smells good. And that's what Smyrna means. I mean, basically it's talking about something good, something that people appreciate. It had a good reputation in an aspect, not in all aspects, and definitely not in regards to Christian principles or even godly principles at all. The town still exists today. It's a town in Turkey called Izmir. It's always been noted for its beauty. One of the things that was significant about it was the temples that they had built. They were temples to the pagan gods that they served, but coming in from the coast, when you looked up there, it looked like a crown. And it was in the shape of a crown. At one point, they even said they had a street of gold in there. Now, I don't know if it was real gold or just a colored gold, but when I was reading about the town a while back, I remember saying that it had a street of gold in it. And so they were religious people, but not godly religious. They were pagans and heathens, and that's what the people there were surrounded by. The Christians were having to deal with those kind of people, and so this was a place where they definitely were persecuted. In Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is a very famous book, basically, talking about the martyrs of the church, it said that at that time and in that place where we're talking about, 5 million Christians were killed. When I read that, I didn't know it was those kind of numbers. That's a lot. And so they were facing persecution. And in this particular passage of Scripture, first we're going to see that this is from Christ. Remember, it was John who saw these things in a dream and wrote them down. And this is Jesus' words encouraging this congregation. In verse 8 there it says, "To the angel of the church of Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life." So these are the words of the first and the last, the one who died and came to life. Jesus. And so these are his words. He is encouraging this particular congregation in a city that was just filled with paganism. Now, I don't know how much paganism you have here today. Just basically a lot of sinful people in the world. But I live near Austin, and boy, it sort of seems to be prevalent. People even brag about being pagans. They wear it as a badge of honor. And it's unfortunate that we have those situations to deal with today, and it's influencing all of the things that impact us personally, individually, with businesses, and with our homes, and our taxes, like we talked about in class. Sometimes we end up being taxed for things that are just unbelievable, and it's unfortunate that happens, and that influence is there. And what we need to diligently strive to do is to keep those influences out of the church and continue to do God's will, regardless of what the world around us is doing. And this particular congregation, written about here in Revelation, here in Smyrna, is an example of ones who, in the midst of heathenism and paganism and false teaching among their own, false teaching among those in other religions who thought themselves to be greater, like the false teaching of some of the Jews in that area, and just the things that they were working together to do. At one point, I'll talk about it in a minute, where the Jews and Gentiles were actually working together to persecute the saints. It's amazing. Two people at odds working together, but they were working against the church. The church of Smyrna showed that they were unwilling in these times of tribulation to compromise. Verse 9, we have Christ's approval, his approval of the church. The church of Smyrna is unique in the 7 churches of Asia. It's the one without criticism. It's unique. It's different. It's not like the other 6 were just horrible and terrible. They had issues. Smyrna, those kind of issues didn't come up. And that's significant. It's important to see this as that church that was doing the will of God. Verse 9 says, "I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." Basically, they were being persecuted for not compromising the truth. And that's why the Jews and the Gentiles were ganging up on them, because they were standing on the truth. We might find that same situation today. When we stand for the truth and we have people who claim to be brethren yet hold false doctrine, and then come after us, or if we have issues with them, or we have difficulty in studying with them and keeping them on the straight and narrow, and a lot of times they eventually drift off into an area that it's difficult to return from. And so we need to watch out for that in our own lives. Here's what Jesus saw. One, he knew about their works. And we know that just because he's addressing them. They had a reputation. And so he looks to them and he says, "I know about you guys. I've heard about you guys. You guys have a reputation." And they were, by implication, active in their faith. And I like to say in their faithfulness. They were active in their faithfulness. And the things that they were doing, they had a reputation that was seen by those around them. They also had tribulation. He says, I know about your tribulation. And boy, if we could probably spend a whole class on talking about the kind of tribulation that the church was going through at that time, and that the Christians were being persecuted for and suffering for, and the tribulation was great. But notice he also says that they were poor. And so they had the tribulation, and then also the fact that they didn't have a lot of monetary means. They didn't have a lot of physical possessions. A lot of these folks were just living. When you look at the Greek words that are used here, like for poverty, it basically means somebody without anything. And I thought that was unique also, in that it was talking about somebody that, like the widow with giving of her money. And even though it was such a small amount in the big picture, the bigger picture was that she gave all. She gave more. And that's kind of the way I see these folks. That even though they were not seen as somebody with a great amount of wealth, and it identifies them as those who are poor, Jesus says, but you are rich. Now, hopefully we can understand that he's making the juxtaposition between the physical situation that they're in and the spiritual situation that was able to come from them, that they were able to produce, that they were able to be spiritual, even though they were physically poor. They were rich spiritually. And for that, they were persecuted. They were persecuted by the Jews, they were persecuted by the Gentiles, and basically it comes down to Satan was very successful in his efforts against the church at this time. He's still fairly successful today. There's a lot of activity going on that he is still responsible for. And their poverty. So the three things that Jesus saw was their works, their tribulation, their poverty, and their richness. So we've covered pretty much all of those things. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 10, it says, as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, yet possessing everything. Paul speaking about another group of Christians who, like the Christians there in Smyrna, they were sorrowful but rejoicing, poor yet rich, having nothing yet having everything. And then also in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9 it says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Again, we have the comparison and the differences that are drawn by the two different situations, the physical situation and the spiritual situation. Spiritually rich, physically poor. And, Jesus having these great physical blessings, being in heaven, having not want for anything, and giving those up to come here, in order that we might also be more spiritual. We might have spiritual blessings in our life. It is a wonderful thing to see that our struggle here is not with flesh and blood. Do we struggle with flesh and blood? No. Yes, we do. Sometimes it can bring us down. Sometimes it can take control of our lives. The physical things that we have to deal with, the physical things that we are burdened with. And he sees that situation numerous times and offers encouragement that the physical is temporary. In a moment he'll talk about that in the tribulation that they will face. Just 10 days. And that's figurative, not literal. It's an amount of time that is going to end. It's not going to be permanent. It's something that happens for a while and then goes away. And we relate that to the physical realm that we live in and striving to have a spiritual life and the future that we look forward to of being with him in heaven for eternity. And that this is temporary. Our struggle is not with the flesh and blood. And yet, Sometimes we let that consume us. We let that take over in our lives, and that becomes the only thing that we are concerned with. Evidenced by the church in general today. You might even say religion in general. You want to go ahead and just throw a blanket over it. People are more worried about their physical condition than their spiritual condition. And so it's reflected in the spiritual condition of our nation, the spiritual condition of our churches, the spiritual condition of our families, the spiritual condition of ourselves. We need to remember that this physical is temporary. What we're working on is the spiritual, because it is eternal. We have spiritual battles. Now, in Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 19, is an example of individuals who are struggling with the physical and the spiritual. And I want to read that to you and remind you that this applies to us figuratively. He's going to be talking about circumcision and uncircumcision. And basically he's talking about whether or not we're faithful and whether or not we're following the will of God. He says, "But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. If a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God." Remember, the audience he's speaking to was Jews, and so obviously he's pointing out the hypocrisy of many of them at that time, who would teach the truth but live something else. And I think we can really relate to that today. Hopefully not too personally, but we can relate to people around us being that way. You know, identifying themselves as spiritual but living unspiritual lives completely. Lives that on the surface you wouldn't know they had any relationship with God whatsoever. That's been creeping into the church from the beginning. It's been a problem all along. It's something that was understood, written about, condemned, and it's something that continues today. We should understand it. We should condemn it. Following God's will is what he wants us to do. And God knew that even though they were facing trials and tribulations and persecution, they were remaining faithful. Sometimes it's hard for us to completely identify with some of the churches that we read about in the Bible. Think about the persecution that they faced, and think about the persecution that you face. Sometimes there's no comparison. I mean, you know, if you're going to make a little chart that showed levels of persecution and you had a 0 to 100, you know, we're down here below 10, maybe even below 5 in regards to actual persecution in our life. You know, some people identify the most menial things as persecution, when it really shouldn't have an impact on our life whatsoever. And then you think about the churches that we read about in the Bible, and even today we can communicate with some churches in other places that are facing persecution, and there are ways in which the church is facing persecution today. In general, we worry about laws that are being passed and individuals who have an agenda in order to either get rid of religion or get rid of God or things like have those fears, and those are forms of persecution. But think about the persecution that they faced in that day. How encouraging it should be to us, and how easy we should see it is for us to be faithful today compared to the difficulties that they faced at that time. So, Christ approved of them and encouraged them, and he encourages them even more in verses 10 and 11. Christ's admonition to them says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." So, a moment ago I mentioned that tribulation being temporary in the 10 days, and that's where we find ourselves there in verse 10. And he encourages them in that situation by basically pointing out what I mentioned a moment ago. It's temporary. It's not going to be forever. And while we might find ourselves in a similar situation, we definitely should be able to identify with it. Maybe not to the same extreme or length that they did, or that our lives are currently in. But we can relate to the fact that they don't necessarily have the approval of men. I'm sure that there are a lot of folks that we could go out there and talk to them about the truth, and they wouldn't approve. They wouldn't like it. And so we find ourselves in that situation. But when we don't have the approval of men on matters of truth, one thing we can be assured of, we do have the praises of Christ. He appreciates, he loves, he expects our faithfulness. And here he's encouraging these brethren who are facing these difficulties of those that were persecuting them, and wanting them to remain faithful in those circumstances. It is the goal of many preachers, should be the goal of all preachers, that they would encourage the congregation in their faithfulness, regardless of what they're facing. Physical needs, spiritual needs, all of those things. And work towards the faithfulness of each and every one of us. First of all, his encouragement to them was to not be afraid. Now, have you ever been afraid of something? Some people are afraid of heights. Some people might be afraid of deep water. Some people might be afraid of the high dive. Combination of the two. Some people might be afraid of different things. Might be afraid of spiders. Somebody might be afraid of snakes. Things like that. None of my kids are that. Oh, a spider. You're going to pick it up and play with it. Oh, a snake. Look, oh, look, we have a pet snake. You come visit me, okay? I don't want to go visit your snake farm over there. But you ever have somebody tell you, "Don't be that way"? You say, "I'm worried about a test coming up." "Oh, don't worry about it." It's hard. But you know what? The encouragement is still good. It is. Even though sometimes we may not acknowledge it at the time. When someone's encouraging us, it's okay, don't be afraid. Jesus is saying the same kind of thing, but it's much more serious here. And he wants them to be comforted. He said, don't be afraid. Yes, he acknowledges the fact that you're going to go through some tribulation. It's going to be difficult. You might have a hard time. But don't be afraid, because you can overcome. And Revelation 2:10 is one of my favorite verses. I hope it's a favorite for a lot of people. Maybe not always in the forefront of your mind, but being faithful unto death. And I like to point out, there's a lot of versions that say until death, and that's not correct. It's unto death. So the word unto is different from until. Until, you're counting days. Unto has to the point of death. You're being faithful to the point of death, willing to give your life for your faithfulness. Now, we may not have faced those kind of situations in our own life, but there are definitely individuals out there today that have faced that circumstance and may be facing it even now. There is persecution that occurs today. Fortunately, we're not faced with that kind of persecution. None of us are going to have to worry about somebody coming in and arresting all of us and putting us to death. But hopefully our faith is strong enough that we can endure that kind of persecution, that kind of tribulation. And that's the kind of tribulation they were facing, and he wants to encourage them in that situation. James chapter 1 and verse 12, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Hebrews 12 and verse 13, "And make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed." He encourages us to be faithful, to be steadfast, even when times are difficult, even when the path is difficult, even when our physical abilities limit the things that we can do in our relationship with God. You know, it's hard sometimes for us to realize that there is a cost associated with being faithful to God. And if we're not experiencing that, then we need to examine our faithfulness. Because the Bible tells us clearly there are some places and some times where we will be persecuted, where we will suffer, where we will have to overcome if we are living a faithful Christian life. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 through 19, another encouragement in times of difficulty. It says, "Beloved, be not surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous are scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." Being faithful unto death. Much encouragement we can find in the Scriptures. We can also find examples in the world of encouragement. Sometimes we read stories in bulletin articles or other sermons that we hear. We might hear an example of an individual who is an encouragement to us. One of the, technically the first recorded martyr was Polycarp in 155 AD. Now, there were other martyrs before that, and they are spoken of, but as far as one that was recorded and what happened and the events that occurred in his life and how he became a martyr, he was the first. When he was living a faithful life as a Christian, as far as we can tell. I mean, there was a lot of false teaching going on at the time. There are faiths today that claim him for themselves, and let's take it with a grain of salt. But he was faithful as a Christian to the point of being persecuted by Jews and Gentiles at that time. His life was in danger for the Christianity that he professed. And some people encouraged him to go and hide because he knew that the people were after him. I'm not going to hide. When they finally came to him, one of the things was they sent a whole troop, I think 7 or 8 men, to go and take him. He was in a farmhouse with a couple of other people, 86 years old, and they sent 7 or 8 guards to go get him, 7 or 8 fighting men, policemen, basically, to go and get him. The comment among them was, why did they send so many to get this one individual? And also, he didn't refuse to go with them. He said, give me an hour. And so they granted him that. And a couple of hours later, he finally came out. And they were going to go their way, but some of them pulled him aside. Some accounts say that some friends of his and said, what's it going to hurt to say Caesar is Lord, or to give some incense to his statue over there in the temple? You know, sounds kind of like Job's friends. You know, that just give it all up, renounce it all. It'll all go away. And he said he wouldn't do that. He said, 86 years have I served him, and he has never wronged me. How then shall I blaspheme the king who saved me? Other things were said, and he had been taken up to council, and in part of it he says, I'm a Christian, and if you want to learn about Christ, set an appointment, and I'll teach you. You imagine a judge is about to put you in jail for your faith, and you say, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we make an appointment for me to teach you about this? It's amazing. They were incensed. He says, I have wild beasts, pointing out that he'll put him in the Colosseum, which was going to be the punishment, where the lions would come and eat him. That was a real thing. It really happened. It's not a movie thing. And Polycarp says, bring him on. Amazing. Then they said, well, then we'll burn you. He said, that's fine. Do what you have to do. Basically, I'm paraphrasing some of the things he said. And the Jews and the Gentiles were working together for his death. They wanted to see him dead. They wanted him to burn. And so the Jews and the Gentiles went and gathered wood in order to burn him. By the way, this was the Sabbath. Is that a problem for the Jews? It's a big problem, but they were willing to set aside their faith and their belief to do what they wanted to do, to set their own agenda. And when they went to, some say they went to nail him to a post, not a cross. Some say that they were going to tie him to it. But either one, it is agreed. Historians say, he says, don't bind me, I will stand in the flames. And he did. They piled the wood around him. They made it called a pyre. And he was on top of it. And they burned him alive. An example, yes, worldly, not biblical, not scripture. An example nonetheless of one who was faithful unto death, to the point of death, willing to give his life for it. A faith that costs you nothing is worth nothing. Principle that we should strive to remember in our lives. The church at Smyrna was a dedicated church. They endured under great persecution, but Jesus knew their suffering, and he encouraged them to keep the faith, and in so doing, they would receive the crown of life. I hope that you will be encouraged to remain faithful and dedicated to the work of the Lord, so that you may receive that crown of life promised to those who are. Today, if for whatever reason your life is not right with God, I encourage you to take the steps necessary to, one, find out the truth in that matter. And if you know the truth and there is something in your life